Hi there, I'm Joel, CTO at Agility. Trust but verify. It's a Russian proverb, ironically made famous by Ronald Reagan when talking about nuclear disarmament, mostly with Russia. I find that an interesting way to raise the stakes on the conversation about truth in content, especially for those of us in the content industry or those of us who care about content. But why would you trust me when I make the claim about what a past US president did or didn't say? By default, you shouldn't. You should look for first sources. By all means, you should be fact checking me. Now, once upon a time, people didn't even trust printed books, even the Bible, unless it was written by a scribe or a monk. They would handwrite it. Now, Gutenberg, like many of today's tech innovators, made that press, right? He faced much skepticism. And there's a lot of parallels today between the printing press and AI today. New technologies have always scared people. The Scribes Guild destroyed printing presses and chased the book merchants out of town. And today we see the printing press as a positive development, but it was feared. Unlike AI, people worried about job security, disinformation, but society adapted. It didn't break down. Now, the fears of 16th century workers mirror our own about AI. While we're unsure of AI's impact, history shows society will adapt. Now, quite interestingly, the first versions of OpenAI's ChatGPT were publicly, supposedly, trained on books. But why did they do that? Well, when we look at a book these days, we think if someone printed in a book, that it must be true, it must be really worth printing. But it turns out that many of the books that ChatGPT trained on were sci-fi and fantasy, not just, classic tomes and textbook that we may have imagined to be the fountain of knowledge and intelligence. Also, it turns out that the majority of the data in ChatGPT 3 was actually just so-called common crawling, just crawling the websites of the internet that are available publicly. Now, I majored in English at the University of Guelph here in Ontario, Canada. In the late 90s, newspapers were still trusted sources. I never imagined that major papers would print owners' opinions over unbiased truth. We assume that media verifies facts, but trust erodes when evidence contradicts or conflicts with our beliefs. With the internet, anyone can publish and change content. Well, how can we discern where truth is online? We might link to an article, but then days later, it changes into something else. Or, remember Google News when it first came out? Remember they called it beta? Because who chooses what gets to be on the first page of Google News? Is it curated by people? Is there some sort of algorithm? We weren't sure at first. We're pretty sure now it's an algorithm. Algorithms control almost everything on the internet, and they're choosing what you see, and they're helping shape what you believe. So how much do we trust Google? It can lead people to wrong information. When people say, I Googled it, they're explaining that Google told them something, when in reality, it should be the website that Google showed them that's presenting the information. Although over time, Google has evolved to do more and more of that work for us, with inline descriptions and Gemini-generated answers that we presume are derived from what we were actually looking for in the first place. But are they? Are those answers and inline information, are they reliable? Almost before we've been able to answer that for ourselves, we've had a whole new paradigm shift with content to contend with. Look at this. This is what you can see when you get to Google. This is what Google describes is their inline information or what they're going to see. AI overviews are taking over our information. Now, when we look at how content actually gets into search indexes like Google or Bing, it's pretty passive. We publish something to the web, maybe set up a sitemap, and then trust the crawler to do its thing and present that content to users. But should it be that way? Why do we have to wait for Google to actually go and recrawl our content? When we change content, we can't tell Google easily that, hey, we've changed this content. On our sitemap, we can say how often we think content might change, but we're not sure. It's not a very proactive model. This is how I think it should be. What if we had more control of that? Why wait for pages to be indexed? why not push content directly from the CMS API into an index as content is published? No more need to wait for a crawl, and much more semantically rich content from the CMS models could be pushed into the search index. For instance, almost every single thing on the internet is a page, but not all content fits into page format. And if I have something like a piece of product information, there's all kinds of fields that are on that product, different variants and measures of that product that I can describe in my product information system or in the CMS, but that Google doesn't necessarily know. It has to reinterpret that data. Why can't we just push it directly in? By the way, I do believe this will be the model in the future, and this will be the model where if we were pushing content directly into the CMS, we're kind of removing a little bit of what Google does in terms of interpreting that content, and we're taking that on ourselves. And I think that's something that CMS vendors and people that work with content in the CMS should take a closer look at. Now, we have generative AI that's out there as well. But how much do we trust AI? We have generative AI to answer our questions, but how can we trust what we put into these tools? We're typing in prompts that it is using to learn the kind of things that we want to know, but how much can we trust what's coming out? And is what's coming out the same as what it grabbed? So all the content that's in something like a large language model is baked into that model, and then sometimes it'll do extra queries depending on how that model is set up to go and look at for sources of information on the web. But then it takes that and recombines it into its own thing. Now, as an early adopter of lots of technologies, including the internet itself back in the 90s, and as the CTO of a company whose sole purpose is to provide content for our customers' digital properties, I have a lot of questions about how LLMs and generative AI are going to work with content in a way that we can actually verify it as being real and true. It's easy to be a naysayer. One's often rewarded for doing so. Generative AI often provides wrong answers, such as this famous one that Elizabeth Lapato, writing for The Verge, an online publication that often epitomizes the early adopter tech enthusiast mindset. She writes of a now infamous example where asking about presidential pardons of relatives or in-laws returned incorrect results. This is hallucinations. This is where generative AI and large language models and the power that they have starts to kind of fall down. But where is our trust? Where should we be placing our trust? Well, I think we already answered that question a lot. We placed it in social media, and it wasn't just our trust that we put in there. It wasn't just our convictions. It was our beliefs. We trust social media. Why? Because it actually goes back to the oral traditions of pre-written content where I think it's kind of baked into our brains to believe what someone says to us when they're speaking to us. So a lot of the things that we see on TikTok or on Reels or other places in social media, these are videos, often short, of people talking to us where we decide that we're going to believe things when it doesn't matter what is a fact. Someone told us, we're going to believe it. And that is what becomes truth. And so it almost makes this whole discussion moot about what AI is doing, because when people tell us something, we tend to automatically just believe it. And the truth is less important than the virality of that content, which is a little bit sad, but here we are. But whose job is it to ensure that the truth is out there? I've always wanted to do a presentation where I used the poster that was famously in Fox Mulder's office from the X-Files, because he was talking about, aliens coming down and abducting us and people hiding the truth from us. But the fact is, the government itself, is that something that we can rely on to regulate truth on the internet in an AI? Can we rely on the FANG level of companies, these almost oligarchical type high value tech companies who are really determining what truth is out there because they are the ones who are controlling the algorithms? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we can rely on government to control those companies or if those companies to actually care about the truth. Meta, the company behind Facebook and Instagram, has just let go of their truth team, as it were, their content moderation team, and they're relying on algorithms and the community to validate what is true on these platforms. Can we rely on that? What about CMS vendors, like Agility, like I belong to? I believe it is our job to make sure, at the very least, that what people put into our platforms is the thing that ends up on the internet, so that when it is indexed by something like Google or OpenAI's or other LLMs, so that when that content is interpreted, it is interpreted as much in its original format as possible, and the semantic level of the content models that are within there get pulled in as close as possible, so that when these tools and algorithms take over the content and consume it, that the things that they come up with are as true as possible. That may be all that we can do. But I think it's also important to provide the anchor of the internet content, and that we rely on those first sources being there at the very least as references at the bottom of the generated text of LLMs, so that people can, at least if they want to click on to verify, to read the first sources of content. I think that's the least we can do, and I think it's our job to make sure that's still out there.